So what I'm really curious about is why are you all here? To learn. Okay. Okay. What? Yeah, please.
I know that magnesium is closely related to the heart and how it functions.
Yep.
I had a brother pass from a massive heart attack, and I've always wondered if he was magnesium deficient, so I just want to learn more as well.
Well, sorry for your loss. How old was he? 57.
57. I think would die from a heart attack.
Okay, so you need to look up the work of Jerry Sullivan. He was a pathologist who developed what's called the iron heart hypothesis. And he was a graduate of the University of Florida in Gainesville. And he wrote his first article in 1981. His first article was in Lancet. That's like walking into Yankee Stadium and hitting a grand slam first time at bat. The guy was a genius. And what he figured out as a pathologist is that there's a difference between men and women. We know that, right? Yeah. But in terms of how we accumulate iron, men accumulate it from cradle to grave. What's unique about women? For 40 years, women are donating iron every month, and they don't have heart disease. But when they go into menopause, they get heart disease because they stop menstruating. It's not complicated. And he wrote a very important article in 2004, and the title was, "Is Stored Iron Safe?" And everyone here probably knows about ferritin. Some of you may even know what your ferritin level is. And what will surprise you is to learn that ferritin in the blood is empty shotgun shells, and that the iron has already been discharged in the tissue. And what I'm guessing happened with your brother is he was a stress cadet, and he was accumulating iron in his heart, which was burning up his magnesium. But then it begs the question, why was the iron accumulating in his heart? Because he didn't have enough copper to regulate it. That's all I focus on 3 minerals: magnesium, copper, and iron. And we need more magnesium, we need more bioavailable copper, and we need less iron. So if you're in a hurry and you need to get somewhere, you've got my presentation. We need more magnesium, more bioavailable copper, and less iron. And I'll explain to you why that's significant. I'm not going to be a slave to the slides, but I'm going to show a few. What I think is really entertaining about the fact that I'm starting at 4 o'clock is I could keep talking all night long, and I would, if you all would stay here. So hopefully that gives you some perspective on what happened with your brother. Yeah. And the whole theory about cholesterol, it's just a scam. Because what they never told us was, one of the most important things you'll learn from reading this book is when they started putting iron filings in our food system. Does anybody know when that started? 1941, during the Second World War. When Germany started bombing England, they started putting iron filings in the wheat flour in England, Canada, and the US. Then in 1969, the FDA wanted to increase the iron in the food 300%. And 26 scientists from around the world came to Washington, D.C. and said, "What are you trying to do? Kill people?" And so the FDA backed off and only increased it by 50%. And everybody loves to talk about how, oh, I'm gluten sensitive. And I understand that. And we can talk about the gliadin protein. Well, the problem is twofold. One, iron filings in the wheat flour. And the second, what they were talking about in the panel, they spray wheat 4 times to dry it out so they can accelerate the growing process, maybe get an extra season of wheat. And the part that I didn't listen to that panel, forgive me for that, but what most people don't talk about is minerals. And what glyphosate is really good at doing is chelating copper. Incredibly good at chelating copper. I was at a meeting in April a year ago here in Chicago and had an occasion to meet with Stephanie Seneff, a name that I'm sure many of you know, and she said, Morley, would you like to know why glyphosate is so hard on copper? I was like a 4-year-old on Christmas morning. I was like, yes, and we had breakfast. There were a group of people, but she and I were just in this love fest. And she said, glyphosate chelates copper down to a pH of 1. Our stomach acid is 2. And so what glyphosate is really good at doing is it takes copper out of the soil, out of the plant, out of the animal eating the plant, and out of the human eating the plants and the animals. And the scale of it is 1,000 times worse than you think it is. And so Stephanie Seneff talks about, gout, and talks about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and talks about heart disease, and doesn't tell you that all of that chaos is caused by a lack of bioavailable copper that causes iron to rise in the body, which causes magnesium to leave the tissue. Ding, ding, ding. And the other big assault in our society, anybody here have a sweet tooth? Right? Well, a little bit. We're all guilty of it. I'm embarrassed to tell you what happened. We went out to dinner, had a lovely dinner. Then I came home and I snuck 2 cookies. And then I got dessert on top of that. It was like, yes. Yeah, really, that's right. No, but what you have to be careful of is high fructose corn syrup. Why do we need to be careful about high fructose corn syrup? Do you know? Excuse me? Well, it's dried by corn, dried by GMO corn. Thank you very much. There's a protein in our gut, come on, find a seat, come on. There's a protein that allows copper to come inside of our intestines. And that protein is called CTR1. I have no idea what that, I guess it's copper transporter 1, but CTR1 is the very mechanism that we need in order to allow copper from our diet into our tissue. And what high fructose corn syrup has done, and we've known this since 1976, Myra Fields at the USDA, she was an absolute genius. Please say a prayer for Myra Fields for all the research she did, because she started this alarm bell about high fructose corn syrup. But she was able to prove that high fructose corn syrup shuts down CTR1, so there's no copper coming into the system. Everybody knows about iron, right? Nobody knows about copper. They're the only 2 metals that work with oxygen. The only 2 metals, copper and iron. They're called redox active metals. And if they don't play well together, it becomes what's called redox cycling pathology. And it creates what's called oxidative stress, which we know as rust. Well, we all know what a rusty nail looks like, and a rusty pipe, and a rusty car. We're very familiar with that. We can't imagine that that exact same rusting process is taking place in our body. And it is. And what is one of the unique attributes of iron is it's the only metal that causes calcium to leave the hard tissue called our bone, and it's the only metal that causes calcium to enter our soft tissue called our blood vessels and our arteries. And iron is the activating mechanism for both calcium loss and calcium buildup in the human body. Call me crazy, but I think that ought to be something that's taught in doctor school. Don't you think?
Yeah.
Kind of basic, right? So I'm just curious, by a show of hands, who here is worried about their health or their loved one's health? Okay, just about everybody. Is this concern about health, is it higher or lower than it was 5 years ago? Higher. Okay. I'm just curious, and some of you may be familiar with some of the work I've done. And please understand, I'm not a doctor. If I had a PhD, it would stand for passionate hatred for deception.
Yeah.
And my wife is a chiropractor of 40 years, so I affectionately refer to her as a shaman, and I'm a showman. Showman. So, how many people in here still believe in disease?
Believe in what?
Disease.
That exists.
Because it doesn't exist. There is no disease on this planet. But there is metabolic dysfunction that's caused by mineral dysregulation. And what is the fastest way to dysregulate minerals in the human body? Put iron in it. Put supplemental iron in it. Put infusion iron in it. Put food-based iron. Yes? It's a great question. Do you really want to know where that started? It's actually, it's a fascinating story. It goes back to the 1920s. And what they discovered is that in society, at any given time, 1% of society is pregnant. 99% not so much. And there's something that happens in pregnancy that many of the women in here who've had children might know about. It's called hemodilution. That as you are growing this child inside you, you've got to spread the blood around 1.5 bodies. And so hemoglobin actually goes down. So a healthy woman should have hemoglobin around 12, healthy guy about 13, 14 maybe. And what happens in the second half of a pregnancy is that hemoglobin will go down to between 8.5 and 9.5. And this is the work of a UK-based obstetrician who only studied 150,000 live births. And what he discovered was the healthiest babies were born to mothers who had low hemoglobin. Now here's my heartache. My daughter-in-law is a Harvard-trained obstetrician. She gets nervous when it gets below 12. She gets apoplectic when it gets below 10. I'm just a former hospital guy. What do I know? But what I can tell you, I learned from Dr. Frisch. This is a great talk, if you all were able to see this. What I learned, I got a bucket face. It means I'm a thinker. I love to think, but I didn't. And these lines on my face, I've been worried about those for years. He said, that's a God-given sign that you're doing your purpose. I'm like, now how cool is that? So this is my reading for October. And I get up at 5 o'clock every morning, and I read for 3 hours, and I have for 10 straight years, 7 days a week. And I've read about 5,000 articles. That's more than 1,000 doctors you know. So I realized, when I decided to do this work, I decided I'm going to be a thinking person's nutritionist. And I'm going to go into the research. And I'm going to find out what they said in the 1910s, in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. Everything changed when Reagan was in office because the funding moved from government to big pharma. All bets are off now. You have to be very careful with the research you're reading. And how many of you all actually trust the internet as a source of information? Good. Because it's a compendium of gossip. And most of it's garbage. Now, there are some exceptional practitioners. We have the pleasure of having one of them here. Thank you for all your work. It's amazing. And people tease me. They said, well, I go to your website, Morley, to get information. And it's like, okay, you know. What I've learned over 10 years and 5,000 articles is there's certain authors that I can trust. There's certain people. Someone that I'm going to introduce you to is Leslie, it's a man, Leslie Clevay, K-L-E-V-A-Y, one of the great copper researchers on the planet. And he has expressed more truth in his 40-year career than most doctors that I've come across. So you got to be very careful who you're reading. Joseph Prohaska, not so much. And I can go through each of the minerals and identify who the right people are. So you're sort of equivocal about this disease thing. How many have confidence? How many have confidence in their doctor being able to solve the problems that they've got? Yeah, you wouldn't be here, right? Do you? Okay. Okay. That's great. No, that's awesome.
Well, I'm a naturopath, so.
Well, that's great. Okay. I think that's wonderful. How many are here because you want to learn what's really going on inside the human body? Okay. And I'm just curious, you can shout out, what are some of the symptoms and labels that you're most concerned about? You were heart disease. Adrenal fatigue. Inflammation. Or as our clients in Louisiana call it, hey doc, I got some of that inflammation. What was that? Hypothyroidism. Okay. High blood pressure. Diabetes. Excuse me? Depression. Huge. Here's some interesting statistics. I don't know what possessed me to look this up this morning. Does anybody know how many people died in World War I? 40 million people. 2 million of them were Brits and French. 2 million were Germans, excuse me. Anybody know how many Americans died in the First World War? It's fascinating. 300. 300 Americans died in that war. Second World War. How many people died? 80 million. Big jump, doubled. How many Brits and French? 600,000. How many Germans? 5.5 million. In the US, 420,000 lost their lives. And what we've been told and what we're being trained to focus on is the fact that 100 million people have died in wars in the 20th century. And that's a big number. It's a very serious loss of life. But I'm a curious George, and I thought I'd like to figure out how many people have died on this planet since the Second World War. Now, I engage in what's called Morley math. I have to kind of cut some corners. But what I estimate is that 3.8 billion people have died on this planet since the Second World War. And we're supposed to focus on the 100 million that died in wars. And I happen to be convinced that most of those deaths were unnecessary. And I'm not saying that we're going to live forever. Please don't think that. Eventually, we're all going to kick the bucket. But we want to die with grace and dignity, with our faculties, and that's being robbed of us methodically. More statistics. How many people have diabetes? 100 million people in this country have diabetes. That's 30% of our population. Do you know what the definition of an epidemic is? How many people? 7.7% of a population is an epidemic. 30% is appalling. How many people have coronary heart disease? 48% of society has some form of coronary disease. Again, epidemic is 7.7%. So there's no way I'm going to get through all my slides, but I'm going to do a more measured, I've got about 60 slides to go through, but I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to make it available to Julie and Trinity Health, and then you can access that. So you'll have that. So just relax about the slides I'm going to show you. Relax about the slides I'm not going to show you, because I'm going to make sure that you have them. And don't hesitate if you want to ask me questions. You can email me. And what drives people crazy is I give out my cell phone number. It's area code 847-922-847-922-8061. I've never met a question I didn't enjoy. So don't be bashful. Lao Tzu made this observation about 600 BC. Most people would rather believe a simple lie than the complex truth. And so the simple lie is, oh, you've got a disease. You've got heart disease. You've got, diabetes. You've got whatever. And we've been conditioned for our whole lives to believe in disease. The other lie, I think it's probably the greatest lie on the planet, is, oh, you're anemic. I couldn't find the number of people with iron deficiency anemia, but in my humble opinion, it does not exist on this planet. Why? Because you have to have bioavailable copper to regulate iron. And if you don't have bioavailable copper, it gets stuck in your liver, in your pancreas, in your kidney, in your heart, in your brain. Know anybody who has Alzheimer's? It's all iron. So keep in mind, can you see okay? Should I go next door? It's all a matter of perspective. And what's fascinating is that we project what we want to see. So if you want to see disease, you'll see disease. But if you want to get outside that paradigm, you're going to begin to see things differently. Because this is the fight on this planet, is between copper and iron. And it's all about how they interact with oxygen. And if they don't play nice with oxygen, that's where all the problems are. So I started this work about a decade ago with two questions. my stock in trade was forecasting disease. I was pretty good at it. I have what's called pattern recognition. Give me a couple data points and I can run with it. I was fascinated by why is everyone so sick? And what I was learning is that this was actually a study that I did back in 2008 for several hospital systems, and they wanted to know what was the demand for healthcare going to be like in 2025. And every disease index was a hockey stick taking off. It didn't matter what the ICD-9 code was, every one of them was exploding. And then I was fascinated by this thing called anemia, because I knew that iron dominated the planet. It's 36% of the Earth's composition is iron. That's a lot of iron. And yet, we're supposed to believe we're anemic. Well, what that means is if we are anemic, that means that the most evolved species on the planet has lost the ability to metabolize the most important, most dominant metal on the planet. And that didn't make any sense to me at all. And then I stumbled upon this protein. How many people have heard of ceruloplasmin, besides the good doctor in the back? It's just the largest protein in the human body. Give you a sense of perspective. How many people know what insulin is? Okay. There's 25 amino acids in insulin. There's 1,066 in ceruloplasmin. So it's just a modest 42 times bigger. And it has 8 copper atoms inside it. And when it was discovered in 1948 by Holmberg and Laurel, they thought they had discovered the Holy Grail. In fact, they had. And Big Pharma has been demonizing it ever since. So, in fact, ceruloplasmin, or the lack thereof, is what links those two questions together. Why is everyone sick? It's because they don't have any ceruloplasmin to regulate the iron that they keep being stuffed with in their diet. And the system has worked methodically to eliminate ceruloplasmin from our body. So for 30 years, from 1948 to 1977, there were 8 copper atoms inside ceruloplasmin. Then suddenly, boom, 1977, there are only 7 copper atoms. And that was the case for 7 years, for 30 years. And then in the early 2000s, it dropped down to 6. I've asked many research scientists, what happened to those 2 copper atoms? And they have no idea. My personal theory is that's what part of the vaccine program is all about, to change the mineral composition of these proteins. So what I've learned is that life gets very interesting when you try to change the system. Because my goal is to reach 150 million people with this message and to train 10,000 doctors to think differently. And it's not like people are beating a path. I mean, there's really good demand. There's 180,000 people on the Facebook page now. I've trained 300 doctors, which I'm very proud of. But this is like, it's a hard-fought battle, but it's a very exciting battle. And I guess it explains why I have these creases in my face. So we all know about stress. Someone mentioned Mark Hyman. This, I think, is one of the best definitions of stress I've ever seen. The body's inability to make energy for the mind to respond to its environment. Amazing definition of stress. Italian researcher, iron stress is the greatest stress in the human body. Absolutely true. And so we're going to talk about controlling the availability of iron and the physiology of what's called the hypoxic response. A couple months ago, I got a phone call from somebody, and I always answer the phone, and they went, "Oh, that's a hypoxic response." And I said, "Do you have a question?" And she got really nervous. She said, I feel like I'm talking to Mick Jagger. I said, "Well, ma'am, you don't want to hear me sing, so why don't you just tell me what your question is?" So we know what anchor chains are made out of, right? Iron, right? Well, guess what? Stress is connected to symptoms. And guess what the medium is to create the symptom? It's that anchor chain. There is no disease. There's metabolic breakdown of enzyme pathways that got oxidized because the oxygen molecules in your body aren't being managed properly. And because we're human, we're very gullible. And we believe the Merck Manual is telling us the truth. Trust me, the Merck Manual is science fiction. 100%. So there's many different forms, many different sources of stress. This is very important. Many sources of stress. And for people with high IQ, the most stressful thing they can engage in is feeling out of control, feeling helpless and hopeless. Stress rockets take off. And obviously I can add 5G to this, and EMFs and things like that. But there's only one response to stress in the human body. And this theory, where you have magnesium loss followed by a weakened stress response, followed by stress hormones that affect more mineral loss, that then creates electrolyte confusion, reduced energy production, cell death, inflammation, and finally fibrosis and calcification. That was theorized by Alfred Fiedler in 1899. He was a Viennese physician who loved cardiology, and then it was Hans Selye who put it to the test with 30,000 animal experiments. And this is what's raging in society now, is inflammation and fibrosis. Guess what, folks? Iron drives both mechanisms, inflammation and fibrosis. They don't come from Mars. They come from inside iron-toxic bodies. It's not my idea. I'm a fairly careful reader of the literature. Walter Cannon is probably one of the more interesting people to read about stress. He was a professor at Harvard Medical School back in the 30s. Mildred Seelig, many of you may know that name. She was a famous magnesium expert. She came up with a different model of stress where we've got metabolic and psychological stress versus physical and environmental stress. It's a fascinating model. And it triggers different hormonal responses. But what's really important to understand is that iron affects all four of them. Iron is a metabolic stressor. Iron is a physical stressor. Iron is a psychological stress. You're like, wait a minute, what are you talking about, psychological stress? Well, there's a protein in our body called NLRP3. It's also called the inflammasome. It's the nuclear origin of inflammation, and it's also called the danger response signal. And at a cellular level, there's a psychological response to iron that shouldn't be there. And it's clearly a physical and an environmental issue, given that they're adding it to our food system at raging levels. So we live on this planet that has a lot of iron, and for billions of years, I don't I don't know how they know this stuff, but they claim that the Milky Way galaxy started 11 billion years ago, and that Earth came on the scene about 4.5 billion years ago. I don't know who's keeping the clock, but that's what they say. And then 2.45 billion, I love that. We need that extra decimal point, right? 2.45 billion years ago, phytoplankton in the ocean started splitting water. And oxygen started to accumulate on the planet. And it's called the Great Oxygen Event. Many astrophysicists and biologists write about it. GOE, Great Oxygen Event. And what happened? Wiped out 99% of life. Why? Because iron and oxygen don't play well together, do they? Boom. And then it's absolutely fascinating. Simultaneously, three events took place on planet Earth. Again, I have no idea how they know this, but they claim that they have fossil evidence of this. Copper, very important enzymes called multi-copper oxidases, and cholesterol all appeared on the planet at the same time. Now, what most people don't know is how many molecules of oxygen does it take to make one molecule of cholesterol? If anybody knows that, you get a free consult with me. It's 11 molecules of oxygen. So what does that say? It means that cholesterol is an oxygen sink. It's a very important part of living on this planet. And what regulates cholesterol? Copper. What causes it to rust? Iron. And what your brother was never told was that the rusting cholesterol was caused by iron building in his heart and in his arteries. Not because they were withholding it, because it's not taught. As one of my colleagues says, Morley, I was at first quite skeptical of what you were saying. Then I went into the research only to discover, oh my God, he's right. The research, there's tons of research. It's just not being taught. It's absolutely out there, but you have to know how to find it and how to decipher it and then how to piece it back together. So Robert Crichton, one of the great iron biologists on the planet, and Dr. Kaplan have both studied this phenomenon very, very carefully. I shouldn't say this, but I shamed Dr. Crichton into sending me his 2018 textbook for my 65th birthday. I called him up, and we had a lovely conversation. And I said, well, he said, so why did you call? And I said, well, I want a birthday present. He said, sure, what do you want? I said, I want a signed copy of your... He said, no worries. So he did. I was really touched by that. He didn't know who I was from Adam. At one point, I'm sure he was wondering, how did this guy get my phone number? So this is the oxygen molecule, and there are only two things we need to do with it. We need to create energy, or we can create exhaust. That's it. That's all we can do with it. Now what's fascinating about it is that the mitochondria are where we get 90% of the energy and 90% of the exhaust. And so the average cell might have 200 or 300 mitochondria in it. Average heart cell might have 2,000. And we know what the mitochondria do. They make energy, right? And how do we spell energy? Magnesium hyphen ATP. Now what's fascinating is to think about how much energy, how many ATP molecules do we need for one heartbeat? Anybody know? 1 billion. Wow. Yeah. 1 billion ATP. That's why there are thousands of mitochondria in every cardiomyocyte. And so wouldn't it have made more sense for her brother to have been dealing with a cardiologist who could measure the level of energy in his heart? I find it fascinating that doctors, doesn't matter what faith they are, have no idea what the energy level is of their patients. What's the energy production? We should be able to get a meter and just put it on someone like that. Say, you're running a little low. There is no such meter. It's like, Are you serious? And the work of Jerry Tennant, if you're familiar with healing is voltage, when do pathogens wake up? In a low voltage environment, when there's low energy. They all thrive in that environment. Oh, did I forget to tell you that iron in the mitochondria builds? And as it builds, the energy level goes down because oxygen is being robbed from the mitochondria because iron is very acidifying. And then suddenly you don't have any oxygen to work with. So it turns out the copper determines the fate of oxygen. How many of you have been to a restaurant? Okay? And many of you have probably witnessed the grandeur of waiters. And what do waiters do? They carry food, right? And most restaurants have lots of waiters, but only one, got to have my audiovisual prop. They only have one chef, right? Well, they do, of course. Right. But in my story, there's only one chef. Dr. Liz has 3 sons who are chefs, so I stole one from her middle son. But the thing is, copper is the chef, and it activates the oxygen. And it turns oxygen first into hydrogen peroxide, and then it completes the cycle to make it 2 molecules of water. And when those 2 molecules of water are given off, the most amazing thing happens. 3 precursor energy molecules are given off, 3 ADP. And so then they go over to complex 5. It's called ATP synthase. And it's a rotor that's spinning 9,000 revolutions per minute. And every cycle through, it's giving off 9 magnesium ATP. So it gets to be a big number pretty fast, as long as you have magnesium. As long as you're not burning up your magnesium with too much iron. So we've got copper, and we've got iron. So for every molecule, or every, atom of copper, how many atoms of iron are there in the body? 60. And what we're supposed to believe, this is what we're supposed to believe, that bad booga-wooga copper is causing all the problems in the body. And you just ignore this iron thing. You're anemic. You're not. You don't have too much iron. You're anemic, and you're copper toxic. And that's the social meme of society and social meme of all doctors, when in fact copper regulates iron. And if I had 4 hours, I could wear you out with the regulation between copper and iron. There's a whole series of enzymes for copper to activate oxygen so we can create energy, and to deactivate oxidants. Copper deactivates oxidants through a whole series of enzymes. Superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, catalase, paraoxinase. It's ridiculous that this isn't taught in kindergarten. And then iron does its thing to deliver the oxygen. But what I just learned this week, it's fascinating. The iron that's attached to transferrin that brings oxygen to the cells, the iron that brings oxygen to the cells is in a +3 state. It's called ferric iron. That ferric iron is made either at the enterocyte in the gut or in the macrophage, where it's recycling the iron. And it turns ferrous iron into ferric iron so we can load onto transferrin. Absolutely essential process. It's called oxidation of iron, going from +2 to +3. And then it can bind to transferrin. When the transferrin comes to the mitochondria, though, that iron's got to be turned back into +2. And what I learned this week is fascinating. is that it's complex 4 of the mitochondria that turns ferric iron back into ferrous iron so it can be given off to enzyme number 8 in the heme pathway called ferrochelatase. Ferrochelatase is a crane operator that drops the ferrous iron into the heme. And who's a crane operator? It's copper. So if you're anemic, you need more iron, right? No. The whole problem is a complete myth understanding about who is in charge of managing iron in the human body. And the worst possible mistake that's made day in, day out, week in, week out, is practitioners of all faiths who think that iron in the blood equals iron in the tissue. And that's the biggest mistake on the planet. What Bruce Ames discovered in 2004, for those of you who don't know Bruce Ames, he was at one point the most quoted scientist on planet Earth. When Bruce Ames spoke, people listened. He was the E.F. Hutton of science. He discovered in 2004 that iron in the tissue can be 10 times higher than iron in the blood. The greatest mistake made on the planet is thinking that people are anemic. You have dysfunctional iron, I'll buy that, but you do not have an absence of iron. And don't ever let a doctor tell you you're anemic. What I think is fascinating is that 46% of the copper in our body is in the bone marrow. That's a pretty significant fact. Oh, isn't that where the new blood cells are being made? Yeah, in the bone marrow. And less than 1% is found in the blood. So let's base the copper assessment on blood and ignore the bone marrow. I'm aware of the fact that measuring bone marrow copper might be painful. But what I think is a real problem is not enough practitioners are trained to question what caused the copper to leave the many cupro enzymes, especially the 6+ coppers in ceruloplasmin. That's the biggest assault in our body. Is there food agents, there are supplement agents that cause copper to leave ceruloplasm day in and day out. Anybody want to know what the biggest cause of ceruloplasm breakdown? You might want to grab your seat belts. It's called ascorbic acid. We know it as vitamin C, and there's no comparison between whole food vitamin C and ascorbic acid. But I have 15 scientific citations from 1948 to 2012 by preeminent scientists from around the world, all agreeing on the fact that ascorbic acid kills ceruloplasmin, the biggest and most important protein in the human body. I'm going to do this and then I'll open it up for questions. So, the dynamic between iron and copper. It's important that you know that iron has a relationship with sugar and a relationship with vitamin D. And what sugar and vitamin D do is cause iron to go into storage. That's an important thing to understand. What we want is iron in circulation. We want iron mobilized, moving in the body. We do not want stored iron. Copper, on the other hand, has a relationship with fat and vitamin A. Fascinating. In fact, you cannot absorb copper without fat in your diet, and you cannot metabolize fat without copper in your tissue. And vitamin A is, in fact, the critical agent to load copper into ceruloplasmin. And what is society now? It's a low-fat society. So we know that iron is magnetic, And we know that copper is electric. We know what gravity is. We've got that big ball of iron. That must be what's pulling everything down, right? Well, what's the reverse? It's called levity. The universe is expanding, and it has been for a long time. That's the power of levity fueled by copper. Thank you very much. And we have two different paradigms in healing. One is called attack the guest. The other is called strengthen the host. Call me crazy, but I think we ought to spend less time attacking guests and spend more time strengthening the host with bioavailable copper. But here's where it gets fascinating. Did you see that? This is what the food system has done. It's eliminated copper, fat, and vitamin A from our diet. What happened to the three agents that are connected with iron? They've all gone up. And yet we're supposed to believe that we're anemic. So here's fascinating. They've done a study of cereals, only to find that they can be off by 380% in the amount of iron that's actually in them. And what's the number one nutrient deficiency on the farm worldwide? No, come on. Copper. Number one deficiency on the farm is copper. And for anyone that you know who's having trouble conceiving, going through IVF programs or whatever, just point out to them that if they were a critter on the farm and they were having trouble conceiving, there's only one nutrient the farmer would add to their feed. It's called copper. And it doesn't cost $25,000. So copper is pretty special, and iron, I mean, it's just, I'm taking a very different point of view. So I'm going to stop there. I promise you I'm going to finish the slides under a separate spot. But what questions do you all have that I can answer? Yes.
Me.
Yeah.
Can you speak about estrogen dominance and copper toxicity? Is there a connection there, and zinc deficiency?
And zinc deficiency, okay. So a lot of people are worried about estrogen dominance. And estrogen dominance appears in people who are iron toxic and have low bioavailable copper. If you have healthy levels of ceruloplasmin, that's the master antioxidant protein in the human body. Depending upon how you want to argue it, I could say that there are 24 enzyme functions that ceruloplasmin engages in, or I could argue it's 224. So it defies the whole concept of one gene, one protein, one function. Ceruloplasmin drives Big Pharma crazy. So that's the master antioxidant, and if that's missing, as it is in most people's body in this room, the body has a backup plan. And it uses estrogen as the backup antioxidant for the excess iron that's in the body. Why is the copper appearing toxic? It's unbound. It's come out of the ceruloplasm. Why did it come out of the ceruloplasm? Because the person's probably taking iron supplements, ascorbic acid, vitamin D, and zinc supplements. So what happens with zinc? Zinc will show, only 1 minute? Zinc will show low in a blood test. Why? Because someone who's stressed out, their liver has lost a lot of magnesium. Why did the liver lose all that magnesium? Because it's got too much iron there, right? So the iron caused, they didn't have copper, so then the iron built up in the liver, so then the magnesium went to the urine, and then the body's backup plan for magnesium is, hey, take some of that zinc out of the blood, let's put it in the liver, and we'll patch it up with zinc. Not knowing that what happens when you take zinc supplements, you trigger metallothionein protein, automatic like that, and metallothionein binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. The worst possible thing you can do is take calcium, iron, zinc, and vitamin D. Those are the 4 most toxic supplements on this planet. Calcium, iron, zinc, and vitamin D. The root cause protocol, you can find it at rcp123.org. And what that protocol does is it teaches you, leads you by the hand on how to increase the bioavailable copper in your diet, in your supplement routine, to lower the level of iron so you don't have the voracious magnesium burn rate. Yeah.
About selenium.
There are 3 selenium enzymes that I know of, and 2 of the 3, the one that's involved in glutathione and the one that's involved in cleaving off the iodine, there's compelling research that proves that they only work best in copper-replete animals. Selenium gets a lot of buzz, and copper gets none. So I'm not a Luddite. I know what selenium does, but it works in bodies that have bioavailable copper.
Will selenium waste copper?
I don't know that. It's a possibility. That's a really good question. Yeah.
So you said sugar and vitamin D cause iron to go into storage, but fat and vitamin D,
Fat and vitamin A.
I mean, that's what I meant to say, cause what? Do what?
It allows copper to become bioavailable so that copper can regulate iron, so that iron can be in circulation in the body, so that when iron gets into tissue, what does it do? It causes rust. It's not complicated. It's a very simple metal. You had a question?
Yes, when you referring to vitamin D, you referring to that simply as the supplemental pill that someone takes
Right.
as opposed to vitamin D?
Right. So she's asking about supplemental D versus the natural D. So the biggest difference is sunshine D is water soluble. Supplemental D is fat soluble. It takes 4 years for supplemental D to get out of your system. And what you don't know is that there's compelling research by Zager, 1999, that talks about iron being stored because of vitamin D supplements. And the research I know you don't know about is by Dr. Ferris from Yale Medical School, 1962. Vitamin D supplements cause renal potassium wasting. Now, why is that important? Because when you lose potassium in a cell, guess who comes in? Iron, ding, ding, ding. Why? Because potassium is what's protecting the pH. As soon as potassium leaves, the pH drops and iron says, I'm here. And people have no idea what they're doing with vitamin D. And why is their vitamin D low to begin with? Because they're stressed out and they have lack of magnesium, which is the critical cofactor to turn cholesterol into storage D and turn storage D into active D. Yeah.
So are calcium deficiencies a fiction?
Calcium deficiencies?
Yeah.
Are you talking about like osteoporosis?
Yeah, well, no, I'm saying from your point of view, like you said, there's plenty of iron in the body. You don't need to do supplemental iron, right?
Right.
Is it ever appropriate from your point of view to do supplemental calcium?
You need to familiarize yourself with REID, R-E-I-D, and Boland, B-O-L-L-A-N-D. They're down in New Zealand, and they've been doing an annual study from 2012 to the present day talking about the toxicity of calcium supplements and how destructive they are. And you get calcium from your diet. You never, ever take calcium as a supplement. Ever. And if your calcium looks low or high in the blood, it's from a lack of magnesium. There's bimodal expression. Does that make sense?
Yeah, my mind is kind of exploding right now.
Okay. Wait, here's what, Doc,
You're saying don't take vitamin
Hold.
D, don't take something, whatever, but take magnesium.
right. So let me explain something. You're talking to a guy who was a hospital executive who couldn't stand the insanity of the system, went to the research to say what's really going on, and my recommendations are very countercultural and counterintuitive. but they're based on research. It's not, this is not an opinion. This is not one man's opinion. This is a compendium of 5,000 articles that I've read. I don't have mastery of 5,000, but for whatever reason, late in life, and I'll be 67 in a few weeks, I have a command of the literature that I never imagined I would have. And by the grace of God, it's staying with me. So what you have to do, what I'm really trying to do is give people better information so you can ask better questions, so you can challenge the system. Because what I would confidently say is every aspect of society is designed to weaken us, unfortunately. Yeah. There are 4 broad categories of where you can get it. You get it from minerals in water. It's a great source. Secondly, you can do transdermal. So Epsom salts or magnesium, magnesium chloride oil. Third source would just be food, right? Greens. You know, anything that's green is going to have magnesium in it, right? But especially the big leafy greens, they're very rich, but you got to cook them the right way in lard, right? Because you got to mobilize those minerals, and they work off of fat. And then the fourth way would be supplements. I'm a big fan of jigsaw, malate, glycinate, orotate, gluconate. There are many different forms out there that you can use. And I encourage people to get 5 milligrams of magnesium per pound body weight, or if you want to go international, 10 milligrams per kilo. That's how, I had to do the math real quick. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I understand that I heard this correctly. Did you say that vitamin D causes kidney issues, basically?
Big time. Huge.
So my mom's diabetic, and her doctors had her on vitamin D for years.
So if your mom's diabetic, what's really going on, this is
Kidneys are bad.
right, but they're all tied together.
Right.
So when you become copper deficient, here's what happens. Hypercholesterolemia, hypertriglyceridemia, hyperglycemia, hypertension. All 4 of them take place in bodies that have too much hydrogen peroxide. Where's the hydrogen peroxide coming from? From the mitochondria that can't complete the 2-cycle engine. First cycle is turn oxygen into hydrogen peroxide. Then what's supposed to happen is the second half of the cycle is to turn that hydrogen peroxide into 2 molecules of water. No can do if you don't have enough copper. And so hydrogen peroxide builds. Wouldn't it be cool to have a test to say how much hydrogen peroxide is in your body? Would that be amazing?
Where do you get the copper from?
You're going to love this. Organ meats. Organ meats.
Wait a minute.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Now, so copper's a mineral.
Copper's a mineral.
The only way that animals can't make minerals.
That's right. They got to get it from the soil.
Minerals, and the United States Department of Agriculture for the last 50 years has reported that the levels of magnesium, copper, and
Absolutely.
calcium and zinc are decreasing rapidly, and when you use herbicides on the crop,
Absolutely. I'm with you.
basically eliminates the absorption of the mineral into the food.
I'm with you 100%.
So it's not de facto guaranteed that there's going to be copper in the organism.
Absolutely true. What you've got to do is find farmers who care. They do exist. You look them in the eye and you say, how are you feeding your soil to allow the grass to feed the animal? And there are, no, I know it is, I understand the challenge. But the issue is supplemental forms of copper are very risky. They don't work the way you think they do. They really don't.
Yeah, okay.
And so what's best is to find the animal sources where the animal's done the work for us and has already made the changes in those metals and in those minerals so that we can actually absorb them. Here's the curious thing. Our ancestors ate organ meats and gave the muscle meat to their animals, to the dogs. What do we do in modern society? Well, we're so sophisticated. We eat the muscle meat and we give the organ meats to the dogs. We've got it backwards. And there are hundreds of examples where we've got it backwards. And thinking that you've got to take vitamin D because your vitamin D test is low, well then let's first start with what is low? Well, the range starts at 30 because Dr. Michael Hollick says it's got to start at 30. Well, Dr. Mohammed Amer at Hopkins says there's no clinical benefit above 21. Compelling scientific study at Hopkins to blow out the whole range of 30 to 100. There's no clinical benefit above 21. And then if it is low, why is it low? Because the person's magnesium deficient. Why are they magnesium deficient? Because they're stressed out, usually because they've got too much iron. What does iron do? It causes anxiety. That would be the first thing it would do. Causes digestive distress. Causes glucose dysregulation. And anyone who has kidney disease, did your mom have kidney disease? So it's all tied together. And so is she doing a dialysis?
No.
Okay.
But she's one step away.
Okay. She needs the root cause protocol. I've got 4 people who've gone from stage 4 to 0
But if you
on the
don't-
protocol.
If you don't eat, like, what are vegetarians and vegans do?
That's my question. Isn't the copper in mushrooms and dark chocolate?
Yes, and again, we're back to Peter's question about is it in the soil that allows it to get into the fruit or whatever. He's raising the right question. This is where we need to be activists. We're not going to take on Monsanto. I got news for you. We're not going to win that fight, but we can win the fight with our farmers in farmers markets. That's where we can make a difference. You want me to stop? Okay, well, I'm just going to keep answering questions, but go. RCP for root cause protocol, RCP 123.org. And there's a series of stops, things that you should stop. It's going to shock you what I tell you to stop because many of you are probably doing it. And then there's a RCP 123.org.